Good evening, and welcome to the National Building Museum. My name is Chase Rend, and I have the honor of being the executive director here at the Building Museum, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you this evening for this very special occasion, the presentation of the 14th annual Vincent Scully Prize to architecture critic Paul Goldberger. I would like to first start out by recognizing the jury members who selected Paul for this honor. Jury chair and architect David Schwartz, Ned Kramer, editor-in-chief of Architect magazine, architect Deborah Burke, Gary Haney, design partner Skidmore, Owings & Merrill, Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk, who is also a past recipient of the Vincent Scully Prize, along with Andres Duany in 2004. I commend the jury for their inspired choice of tonight's honoree. The jury recognized Paul for his lifetime work of encouraging thoughtful discourse and debate about the importance of design. Jury chair David Schwartz, who is unable to be with us this evening, shared that Paul is a person that lets people understand the importance of place. Fellow juror Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk added, Paul explains architecture to the popular readership in a way that bridges the perceiver and the designer. He rises above polemics. The namesake of tonight's prize is Vincent Scully. Unfortunately, Vince was unable to join us tonight, but he did write to tell us how delighted he is that we are honoring Paul this evening, and he asked me to read this to you, and I quote, "For more than a long generation, in fact, since he was in high school, Paul Goldberger has been writing the kind of responsible public criticism that is central to the vitality of architectural culture as a whole, rooted in history and capable of dealing with fundamental urban problems. Paul is at once a journalist and a historian, and his range is wide. He has recognized the importance of individual architects from James Gamble Rogers to Frank Gehry, traced the development of the skyscraper, and brought a solid experience of urban history to his agonizing analysis of the rebuilding of Ground Zero. His method has always been a classical one, and his objectives humane, avoiding polemic and seeking out a decent balance between things." The Scully Prize was established in 1999 under the leadership of David Schwartz, renowned architect and, as I said, the chair of our jury. Fittingly, the prize recognizes exemplary practice, scholarship or criticism in architecture, landscape architecture, historic preservation, or urban design. It is with David's vision and the efforts of the entire Scully jury that the Scully Prize has become one of the most significant awards in the architecture and design fields. David has crafted a letter to all of you which reflects the remarks he would have made were he able to join us tonight. It reads as follows. Good evening, Paul and distinguished guests. First, I want to thank the distinguished members of this jury as well as past juries who have labored tirelessly to help make this award all that it has become. Without their contributions and help, this award would never have achieved the luster it presently enjoys. I am sorry that I could not be here to join you all for this year's Vincent Scully Prize, but circumstances beyond my control have made it impossible. It is particularly sad for me not to be with you in that this year's award is being given to Paul Goldberger, someone I have known since our days at Yale together. We have known each other since long before either of us had a professional life or a reputation. And while it was clear, even then, that Paul had a significant intellect and a very real way with words, the indelible mark he would leave on our conversations about the built environment was by no means evident that early on. The Scully Prize was created to recognize and celebrate those who have made a truly significant intellectual contribution to our discussions about the built environment. Few fit the mold for this award better than Paul. Through his writings, teaching, and lecturing, he has made all of us, not simply those of us in the field, both more educated and more discerning about the physical space we create and inhabit. He has helped all of us to understand and be more careful about the legacy we leave behind and more thoughtful about the world we pass on to our children as well as our children's children. There is something particularly poetic about giving this award to Paul, as he was a student of Vincent Scully's and gained the foundations of so much of what he has become through his exposure to Vince. Like so many others, Vince changed the way Paul saw the world and set him on a course that might well have led Paul to very different places had it not been for Vince's inspiration and influence. Like so many others, Vince's touch changed Paul's trajectory and thus changed the trajectory of how and what we build. That is why it is so fitting that this award is named in honor of Vince. He changed many generations that will continue to change future generations to come. All of you who sit in this room tonight have a deep and abiding interest and concern about the built environment, as well as the larger world in which we live. This institution, the National Building Museum, is committed to a better world in total, and I think the intersection this award being given to William Riley, the first director of the EPA, and Paul Goldberger demonstrates that this institution, as well as this award's commitment to trying to help make our world the very best it can be. I feel very fortunate to have been involved with this award since its inception and to have had the opportunity to honor such an august group of men and women. It is with a great deal of pride and pleasure that we add Paul Goldberger to this list. Thank you, and please have a wonderful evening. With best regards, David Schwartz. Long but important, I would say. So, before we get to Paul's prepared remarks this evening, we have asked Maya Lin to say a few words. We first came to know Maya through Paul Goldberger, who was one of the first critics to write about her winning design for the Vietnam Memorial, which, by the way, was dedicated almost exactly 30 years ago. With that work, she virtually redefined the idea of monument and has since successfully forged a path between art and architecture, something very few have been able to do. As the art critic Michael Brenson writes, Maya Lin has been proposing ways of thinking and imagining that resist categories, genres, and borders. Her remarkable body of work includes large-scale environmental works, museum exhibitions, landscapes, and architectural projects. Her work addresses some of the major social and political issues of our time: gender equality, civil rights, Native American rights, and the environment. In all of Maya's work, you can see and feel her deep love and respect for the natural environment. Her work compels us to contemplate and see the natural world in different ways. It asks us to reconsider nature and the environment at a time when it is so crucial to do just that. Please welcome Maya Lin.
Thank you. It really wasn't 30 years ago, right, Paul? It was around 10 years ago. Thank you and congratulations. I'm really honored and proud that you asked me to be here. I cannot think of a more meaningful connection than between Vincent Scully and Paul Goldberger with this esteemed award. Both Paul and I are both former students of Vincent Scully, and both of us have Vince to thank for revealing to us the possibilities and responsibilities of architecture and design in society. Just have to quote from you for a second. Paul remarked, "A long time ago, Vincent Scully convinced an eager Yale undergraduate that architecture was not just about buildings, but about all of culture and community, and that writing about it could be a meaningful pursuit." You weren't kidding. Paul, in all your writings, you have taken Vincent's teachings to heart, but you have made it so much more accessible, and we are so much more connected to the built world through your writings. You have made architecture and design palpable, emotional, evocative. Your writings have taught us to see and relate to the built world, giving us an understanding and appreciation of architecture and design. To borrow from the title of one of Paul's books, Why Architecture Matters, we spend 23, if not 24 hours a day inside the built environment. Yet few people take the time to stop and reflect upon this. We walk by that shiny new glass office building, stroll past where there was once a grand train station, or take our children to a new city park without thinking of the designer's intent, the selection of building materials, or who commissioned the structure. Paul helps us to see and understand. just how much architecture and design matters. He writes, architecture begins to matter when it brings delight and sadness and perplexity and awe along with a roof over our heads. For those who enter the Building Museum's Great Hall for the first time and take in the volume of this space and those 75-foot grand Corinthian columns, it takes your breath away. Architecture and design matter when we decide which building to save in order to preserve our shared cultural heritage. And architecture and design matter when a city invests in new public spaces. Look at how New York City's High Line creates a precious slice of nature in the country's densest city and brought an entire neighborhood alive in New York City. Paul's unique role as critic is to engage in thoughtful dialogue about the meaning, relevance, and importance of architecture. He is an interpreter and a sage. He connects us to the work and to the architects and to their visions. He raises awareness of scale, material, proportion, and humanity. Perhaps most importantly, Paul helps to provide context. He writes in his introduction to Building Up and Tearing Down that architecture always connects to something. It is never a thing unto itself. Buildings and design do not exist in a bubble. Placing a structure within its context enhances its meaning. Paul's work encourages designers and the public alike to consider how a building connects to its urban environment, responds to its surrounding, and enhances the public good. I congratulate Paul on receiving this important prize. He joins a humbling list that includes Jane Jacobs, the Aga Khan, and the Prince of Wales. To quote Vincent Scully, the prize namesake, architecture is communal art, having to do with the whole man-made environment, the human city entire, rather than only the individual buildings in it. Paul's work has helped us see this human city entire. Thank you, Paul, for sharing why architecture matters.
Thank you, Maya. We're so pleased that you could be here tonight, and thank you for the wonderful tribute to Paul. I know that most, if not all of you, know a lot about who Paul Goldberger is. I do want to just remind you of some of his many, many accomplishments before we invite him up here. Paul Goldberger was called by the Washington Post America's preeminent critic of architecture. He's now a contributing editor, as you know, at Vanity Fair, and from 1997 through 2011, he served as architecture critic for The New Yorker, where he wrote the magazine's celebrated Skyline column. He holds the Joseph Urban Chair in Design and Architecture at the New School in New York City. He was formerly dean of the Parsons School of Design. He began his career at the New York Times, where in 1984, his architecture criticism was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Distinguished Criticism, the highest award in journalism. He's the author of several books, as we know, Why Architecture Matters, Building Up and Tearing Down, and he's now at work on a full-length biography of the architect Frank Gehry. He lectures widely. I'm going to scoot through some of this. There's so many accomplishments here, but I do want to say that in addition to the Pulitzer, he has been awarded the President's Medal of the Municipal Art Society of New York, the Medal of Honor of the New York Landmarks Preservation Foundation, which recognizes his accomplishments in preservation. In 1996, Mayor Giuliani presented him with the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission's Preservation Achievement Award. In 1993, he was named a Literary Lion by the New York Public Library. And in 2007, he was presented with the Ed Bacon Foundation's Award for Professional Excellence, named in honor, of course, of Philadelphia's legendary planner. So, it goes on and on. He's a very accomplished man, and we are thrilled to add the Scully Prize to that list of accomplishments. Ladies and gentlemen, Paul Goldberger.
Thank you so much, Chase. That wonderful introduction reminds me of what Lyndon Johnson once said when a very florid introduction was given to him, that he was very sorry that his parents weren't here to hear it. His father because he would have enjoyed it, and his mother because she would have believed it. So anyway, I feel very much the same way. And I could not be more grateful to you, Maya, for being here and for what you've said. This is the most meaningful and pleasing prize that anybody who does what I do can possibly receive. And Maya, by your being here and your words, you have made it even more meaningful and even more pleasing. So I'm deeply grateful, and thank you. I'm grateful also to the jury of the Scully Prize, to David Schwartz for his wonderful words, and to his colleagues on the jury, and to Chase and the other administrators at the National Building Museum, not only for making the choice that they did this year, but for the ongoing commitment they've demonstrated to the ideals of this prize. I'm not sure that there is any other list in the world that includes Jane Jacobs, the Aga Khan, Prince Charles, and Richard Moe. I don't think there ever could be any such list in the world except the roster of Scully Prize winners, and it's an extraordinary honor to be on it. My greatest debt, of course, is not to anyone in this room, but to Vincent Scully himself, who I first encountered as a 16-year-old high school student who went on a college exploratory trip to Yale, attended a Scully lecture, and pretty much decided then and there that was the place for me. I was lucky enough to have it happen, and I went to History of Art 53B, as it was then called, for 4 solid years. Yale, unfortunately, was willing to grant me credit for only one of those years, but it didn't matter. I went year after year anyway. It was always exciting. It was almost always different. And when it wasn't, that was fine too, because it was like hearing a favorite piece of music. And when you were 19 or 20, all you want to do is play your favorite music again and again. I went all the time, I think, because I came to expect the transcendent. And often enough, that was what we got. I remember being astonished when Vince started quoting from Wallace Stevens in the middle of a lecture, or talked about Frank Lloyd Wright by comparing him to Melville, or to Whitman, or to Mark Twain. I think at one time or another he did all three. But whoever it was, the notion that an architect might be discussed by comparing him to a literary figure rather than another architect was a stunning revelation to me. A powerful introduction to the belief that underlies all that Vincent Scully has said and written, which is that architecture is part of the larger culture, and that its meaning comes from its connections to that larger culture. It's a kind of scholarship that is the opposite of hermetic. It reaches outward, it doesn't turn inward. If I may take just one more moment to speak about Vince, I would say that he's based his career on the belief that scholarship exists to make the world better. And when we develop knowledge, we have a responsibility to use it. There's a Hebrew phrase that I've always felt described Vincent Scully's motivation as a scholar, tikkun olam, which means to heal the world. Vincent Scully, as a teacher, has always healed the world. Learning how architecture matters is really the greatest lesson I took from him, more than anything I might have learned about Michelangelo or Frank Lloyd Wright or Louis Kahn or Robert Venturi, was learning that serious intellectual inquiry need not be inconsistent with passion, and that empathy is a true and legitimate part of analysis. And most important of all, that the making of architecture cannot be separated from the making of community. And it was Scully, too, who convinced me that I should be studying architectural history and not English, despite my love of writing and literature, and that there was a life to be lived in architecture that could be separate and distinct from being an architect. I went to Yale thinking architecture would be an avocation, a side interest in my life, and I left it feeling that it would be central to my life's work. The way to do that was to continue on the path I had started toward being a journalist, which is what I did. I entered the small field of architecture criticism because it was where the two worlds I cared most about came together. I've never been great at making choices, and I suppose this was a way to avoid ever making a final choice between writing and architecture. I'm going to talk a bit more about this field over the next few minutes, since one of the burdens of winning this wonderful prize is the expectation that you will deliver a lecture of some relevance to the theme of the prize, the importance of ideas and scholarship to the built environment, and the direct effect that writing ideas and activism can sometimes have on architecture, separate from what we actually build. Architecture criticism, which I'll talk about over the next few minutes, is the front line of this process. It's the way into architecture for most people, the medium through which most people who are not architects connect to architectural thinking, the thing that leads non-architects to think about what is built and how it affects them, the beginning, we might say, of public discourse on the built environment. It's a very different profession from what it was when I began. Architecture is different, of course, and plays a larger role in the public discourse than it did back then, but if anything, journalism has changed far more. There's more similarity between the architecture we're producing when I started out 40 years ago and the architecture we produce now than there is to the nature of journalism 40 years ago and the nature of journalism now. Let me say a word about this first, because it's impossible to talk about the state of architecture criticism today without talking about the state of journalism today. I think it's fair to say that no publication is as powerful as it once was, that nothing, not the New York Times, not the New Yorker, not anything, has the kind of hegemony it once did. No institution dominates in such a way as to be able to set the agenda for architecture criticism any more than any single media organization today can set the agenda for anything else. The context of the overall media landscape is simply too different, and it's changed more completely in the last 10 or 15 years than in the 75 years before that. Television didn't threaten print journalism as the internet has. It just added another medium to the mix. Now, of course, it's different. Even those publications that have established themselves reasonably successful online, like the New York Times, don't hold sway over the world as they once did. If, as A.J. Liebling famously said, freedom of the press belongs mainly to those who own one, well then today, of course, everybody owns the equivalent of a press. Technology means that the playing field is leveled, and now there are a zillion voices out there all clamoring to be heard. If everyone is on the playing field, I'm not sure what kind of game you can have on it, however. It often feels like the swarm that you get when 5-year-olds who don't yet know how to play soccer, and you cannot make head or tail out of what's going on. Neither can they, of course, and that's part of the situation we have in journalism and media right now. It's a swarm that keeps moving and shifting so rapidly that no one can quite grasp its shape, especially if, like those 5-year-old soccer players, you're right in the middle of it. And the chaos on the field can often mean that the most skillful players have little advantage over the others. Now, I don't really mean to compare the state of journalism intellectually to a scrum of 5-year-old soccer players, and it's important to say that the mainstream publications, the ones with a tradition and a history and an ongoing commitment to architecture criticism, certainly continue to possess some degree of authority in this new world. The New York Times architecture column is not building blog. But to many readers, particularly younger ones, it isn't all that different. And what greater authority it has is, for many readers, more of a historical leftover, a form of inheritance than a matter of current-day relevance. In any event, whether they have greater authority or not, mainstream publications struggle to make themselves heard within this new and constantly shifting mix, as well as to shoulder the costs of what we might call the physical infrastructure of print. In many ways, their situation is not that different from that of retail merchants with brick-and-mortar stores to maintain, struggling to hold their own against internet competition. Now, the plight of newspapers today is not exactly the equivalent of Best Buy trying to compete against Amazon, but it's closer than we might have ever dreamed it would be. What makes it different is that there's actually no media equivalent of Amazon, since another effect technology has had has been to break apart the audience into smaller and smaller and more specialized segments. Now, the effect of all this goes far, far beyond architecture criticism, of course, but it has special challenges to architecture. One is that the new media is particularly tempting for architecture because it's so easy to transmit images. I had a long conversation about new media at the end of the last semester with my criticism class at Parsons, and they explained to me that blogs, to them, were old hat. The future, they insisted, was in image-driven apps like Tumblr and Pinterest. Well, I can see the point. New media makes pictures of everything available all the time, instantly, and images spread like wildfire. That has a usefulness in architecture that it doesn't in, say, literary criticism. The idea of media functioning as a kind of continually scrolling portfolio showing you everyone's new work all over the world all the time, it does have a certain appeal. I now assume that a picture of anything worth knowing will sooner or later show up on my screen, often via a Twitter link. And Twitter isn't really such a bad vehicle for architecture criticism. After all, some buildings aren't worth more than 140 characters. And so far as the ones that are worth more are concerned, well, there's a wonderful discipline to boiling things down to their essence. Not enough respect in the profession of architecture criticism is accorded to Strunk and White's famous precept, omit needless words. Now, Twitter may carry this to an extreme, I admit, and few tweets possess the elegance of a haiku. But Twitter does get through thoughts very fast, and it's invaluable as a source of links. And after a lifetime of writing essays and books, I have to admit to a certain pleasure in writing things sometimes that are 140 characters long. But however useful shorthand may be, it's not a way to deal with complexity and nuance. The most serious issues we face in architecture and the most meaningful architecture criticism cannot be reduced to 140 characters or even 1,400 characters. And even when short-form electronic media and social media succeed in doing worthwhile things, as they often do, they have the pernicious effect of getting us more and more accustomed to getting information in short, fast, constant bursts. Who has an attention span longer than about 10 seconds these days? You scroll through Twitter seeking the stimulant of more and more of these little fast injections of data. And before you finish one, you're hungry for the next one. That is not a condition that is conducive to the best criticism. And then there's the other challenge the world of new media presents, which is how you filter all this stuff and in the random way in which we encounter it, given how, as I said a moment ago, this new level playing field is so full of players, it's not always easy to see how the game should proceed. The playing field may be level, but the players are not equal. And somehow we need help in sorting out who is worth listening to and who is not. That's really the first challenge of the new media. Who's going to curate the material that pours across our computer screens all of the time. And you know it never stops. While I've been standing here talking to you, I'm sure I've missed hundreds of tweets. Maybe a handful of them might actually be interesting. Plenty of the things I discover that way really are worthwhile, and for that, new media is invaluable. And I don't know how I functioned before Arc News Now, the daily feed of links to architecture news and criticism around the world, and there is so much now pouring so constantly that next to Twitter, an early and relatively discursive blog like Design Observer seems as loquacious as Lewis Mumford. But even if you succeed in managing or curating or filtering this unending flow of information and comments and observations that land in your electronic home, the problem of the level playing field itself remains. Let me go back to the notion of authority, which I brought up a moment ago. It's not bad that the hegemony of certain organs of old media has been curbed. The world needed to be opened up. But there's an implicit presumption in the idea of the level playing field that all players are equal, and they're not. Everybody's opinion is not equal. It's unfashionable to say that in the age of crowdsourcing, but there is such a thing as expertise and such things as knowledge and judgment. New media does implicitly devalue these, even as it gives the welcome opportunity to all kinds of other people to be heard. But a book review on Amazon and a book review in the New York Review of Books are not the same thing. So how do we maintain some sense of, some way of making sure that meaningful voices are heard amidst what we know is a lot of noise? The answer is not to shut out the noise, because that's impossible. Technology will not roll back, and we need to learn to live with its bad aspects as we benefit from its good ones, in architecture as in just about everything else. And I don't think we really want to go back to an age when just a few voices spoke with a kind of celestial authority, and that was all there was. I have extraordinary admiration for both Lewis Mumford and Ada Louise Huxtable, each of whom, in a somewhat different way, presided for a period as a kind of oracle of architecture criticism, but no one is going to be like that now. The world is not going to permit it, any more than we will have a political columnist with the authority of Walter Lippmann or Arthur Kroc or James Reston, or a theater critic with the authority of Brooks Atkinson or Walter Kerr, or, for that matter, a gossip columnist with the power of Walter Winchell or Liz Smith. There are just too many other voices out there, and they're not just clamoring to be heard, they are being heard. In any event, all of this has to be relevant to the larger question: what is the state of architecture criticism today? Why should architecture criticism exist? Does it make any real difference? Can it do more than just entertain and enlighten a few readers who come to it already interested in architecture? Or can it truly shape the city? And how is new media going to change it? We've just been talking about two opposing trends, two conflicting sets of facts. On the one hand, there's the crisis in journalism, with the rise of electronic media inevitably adding pressure to what was not, even in different times, a very big field. Architecture critics have never been plentiful. On the other hand, there's the greater sense of engagement that people almost everywhere now seem to have with the built environment, the heightened sense of caring about what their houses and streets and neighborhoods and downtowns and public spaces will look like and feel like to use. The lay public, after all, are the users of architecture, which makes architecture different from anything else that is generally considered to fall within the realm of a subject of criticism. You choose the music you hear, the films you see, the books you read, the theater you attend. But other than maybe the house you live in, you almost never choose the architecture you experience. It's imposed on you, often by forces over which you have little or no control. When architecture criticism is doing its job, however, it helps you understand these forces at least a little bit better and gives you at least some agency over them. Not much, I know, but some. And it should give you at least some understanding of how things come to be, of why they are as they are, and of how else they might be imagined. The ubiquity of architecture in our lives should lead to a demand for more architecture criticism, but I think it sometimes works almost in the opposite way. Because architecture is always there, always around us, always visible, yet seemingly so uncontrollable by us, we tend to tune it out. And by we, I mean the average person, not critics themselves. But I think people do develop a kind of automatic numbness to a lot of the architecture they see every day as a kind of protective measure. It's not just because some of it is too painful to look at. It's more because much of it is just too much trouble to look hard at. There's just too much of it all over the place at every moment. And it's hard to pay attention to, and harder still for many people to have any sense that it matters, that the architecture around them can have any effect on their lives. It's the implicit mission of architecture criticism to help people understand that architecture does matter, of course, and why it does. That's why I'm not particularly distressed at the recent trend toward more socially oriented criticism, particularly at the New York Times, where the current critic, Michael Kimmelman, has done an abrupt and total about-face from the position of his two most recent predecessors, neither of whom seem to view political process, issues of urban design, or the social utility of buildings as a priority. If the Times lately has sometimes seemed to define architecture as narrowly in one way as it once did in another, I'm hopeful that in time there'll be a more inclusive balance, as there's been for some time at both the Los Angeles Times and the Chicago Tribune, which have both for several years successfully balanced cultural, political, and aesthetic concerns. It's not really so hard to do all that. Architecture criticism, like architecture itself, needs to be comfortable on multiple scales to engage with single buildings, with preservation issues, with planning of entire cities, and urban design. Architecture needs, in other words, to be comfortable, architecture criticism rather, needs to be comfortable with the notion that architecture is art and is not art at once. That it is an experience of the everyday and also potentially an experience of the transcendent. Criticism needs to take both sides of this equation as its subject. That's not being equivocal. It's just being real about what architecture is. That ought to be clear to everyone now in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy, as challenges of infrastructure and the relationships of buildings to environmental concerns seem more urgent than ever, as sustainability becomes not a buzzword but a very real concept. Buildings do not just happen. They're the products of a particular and peculiar combination of artistic vision, money, political realities, and engineering skill. To the extent to which it's possible to say something about the process by which buildings happen, the critic has to, not to excuse the results, but to place the building within a context that enhances its meaning. You understand Palladio a lot better if you know that the villas he designed around Vicenza in the 16th century were not just expressions of classical grandeur, but attempts to enhance the image of his aristocratic clients, whose houses were as often as not working farms. You understand Herzog and de Meuron's Bird's Nest Stadium and Norman Foster's Beijing Airport better if you see them as having been made possible by the mix of high aesthetic ambition and cheap mass labor that exists in China right now, but may not exist for that much longer. while you did not absolutely have to know that the Basques in northern Spain were eager to remake the old industrial city of Bilbao when they turned to Frank Gehry and the Guggenheim Museum to give them a new symbol of their region, you'll surely understand Gehry's remarkable building better if you know something of its origins and can recognize that there are more complicated and subtle ways to demonstrate respect for context than replication. Still, I know that when we strip away the layers of real estate finance and zoning and construction and politics and get beyond the arguments about what kind of environment is best for educating people or healing people or housing people, and past the question of whether we should or should not rebuild towns of little wooden structures on barrier islands on the Jersey Shore as water levels rise. But when we go through all these other issues, we're left with the fundamental truth that a building is an object. That's what buildings are. Physical objects with walls, floors, ceilings, roofs, doors, and windows, which look in a particular way and function in a particular way. This is what you think about every day as a critic, and what a critic has to think about if he or she is going to do their job properly. Evaluating how a building looks as a physical object and how it functions, and what role it may play in the larger story of our culture, will always be the core obligation of architecture criticism. Good criticism is not judging a beauty contest. But still, every critic needs to feel that the greatest moments of all are those when he or she calls attention to those buildings that, in Lewis Mumford's words, cause people to hold their breath for a stabbing moment, or that restore them to equilibrium by offering them a prospect of space and form joyfully mastered. Matthew Arnold defined criticism as a disinterested endeavor to learn and propagate the best that is known and thought in the world. But of course, the critic who is only an enthusiast risks appearing like Browning's Duchess, too soon made glad, too easily impressed. Implicit within the idea of criticism is the obligation to explain and interpret and to share your judgments as well as your enthusiasms. Yet a critic cannot only be an explainer and an interpreter. It's all well and good to communicate an architect's intentions to readers who might not otherwise understand them, but woe to the critic who makes too much of those intentions and lets them get in the way of clear-eyed judgment. As I look back at the things I wrote in my 15 years at The New Yorker, or during my career at The New York Times, I have no desire to recant anything, but I will admit that here and there are a handful of things I might have thought differently about now, and in just about every case, the shortcoming is because I was too forgiving of architects' good intentions. The reality is no one designs a building with bad intentions, and good intentions have given us a lot of bad buildings. Part of the critic's job is to see through this and to be able to puncture the balloon of architects' rhetoric. In the end, of course, it's the work itself that matters, not the critic himself. Both judgment and enthusiasm can be ways of expressing love, and a critic who does not love his field cannot last long in it. To love this world that all of us here at the Building Museum tonight care about, whether our part of it is architecture, design, planning, historic preservation, or whatever, and also to love what it means in other people's lives, and not only your own, is, I think it's fair to say, a further prerequisite to functioning well as an architecture critic. That's not inconsistent with exercising judgment. Judgment and education go hand in hand and are parts of a critic's role as a kind of interpreter to communicate his or her love of things, and in so doing, instill love in others. The critic Daniel Mendelsohn wrote recently that the serious critic ultimately loves his subject more than he loves his reader, which seems harsh, but it's absolutely right. Mendelssohn went on, because the serious literary critic, or dance critic, or music critic, and we might add, architecture critic, loves his subject above everything else, he will review either negatively or positively those works of literature or dance or music, and again, we can pretend he also said architecture, high and low, rarefied and popular, celebrated and neglected, that he finds worthy of examination, analysis, and interpretation. To set interesting works before intelligent audiences does honor to a subject. Mendelssohn wrote this in an essay last summer that he called A Critic's Manifesto, in which he offered an equation as the basis for a valid work of criticism. It was knowledge plus taste equals meaningful judgment. He explained, the key word here is meaningful. People who have strong reactions to a work, and most of us do, but don't possess the wider erudition that can give an opinion heft, are not critics. That's why a good deal of online reviewing by readers isn't criticism proper. Nor are those who have tremendous erudition but lack the taste or temperament that could give their judgment authority in the eyes of other people, people who are not experts. That's why so many academic scholars are no good at reviewing for mainstream audiences. So a critic is not the same as an academic scholar, and he or she is not the same as a tweeter or an online Amazon reviewer either. A critic may write tweets from time to time, just as he may produce a work of scholarship, but his work as a critic is something different from either of these other things. Criticism is a thing unto itself. And an architecture critic is not the same as an architect. I hope they share a love of their subject as well as a knowledge of it, but after that, they're worlds apart. An architect has a right, maybe even an obligation, a duty, to believe there's a right way to do things, that there's a single direction in which you have to go to solve a particular problem. He or she may tweak and vary and evolve their design as they work with a client, but they're unlikely to reverse course and start and end up 180 degrees opposite from where they started. You don't want an architect who sees too many ways to go, who does not feel a passionate drive toward one of them. But that very worldview that strengthens the architect weakens the work of a critic, who needs to proceed from a pluralist position, at least nominally. He needs to believe that there are multiple solutions to any architectural problem, and that there's validity to many of them. If not, the critic forfeits his ability to objectively interpret, explain, and judge the work that's before him. But a critic has to stand for something, obviously. He or she cannot proceed from the view that anything's acceptable as long as it's done well. So how do you combine an absence of ideology, an avoidance of dogma, for that's what I'm speaking of, with some guiding principles that are necessary for criticism? The answer, I think, lies in the difference between what we might call social or moral or aesthetic issues social or moral or ethical issues and aesthetic ones, between issues of social and political responsibility and issues of aesthetic choice. A critic can and should establish a set of social and political principles that define his judgment and act as a foundation for his criticism. The challenge is to hold onto these principles and at the same time to remain open to a broader range of aesthetic responses to those principles than any one architect might have, and then to be able to judge those different aesthetic responses on their own terms. To say it in a different way, it would be an entirely reasonable critical position to argue that our housing policy is woefully inadequate, not to say catastrophic, that we need to do more to house the poor than put our faith in trickle-down economics, just as it would be a reasonable critical position to argue that we need a wider range of types of housing to adapt to the changing needs of the evolving nuclear family, or to argue that we need to build up the public realm and strengthen our commitment to public space and walkability of cities, or that we devote more of our resources to rebuilding communities in light of climate change and rising sea levels. But a critic who states these positions should then be open to a wide range of architectural responses to them. There are many different architectural solutions to our response to climate change, as there are many different architectural solutions to our need for a better public realm. Social and political values, in other words, are something entirely apart from architectural style. I believe the critic has an obligation to be absolute about the former and open, even agnostic, about the latter. That question certainly has come into play lately here in Washington, where the big architectural story in the last several months has been the struggle over the Frank Gehry design for the Eisenhower Memorial, much of which seems to be motivated by a demand that the memorial be redesigned in the classical style, an insistence that's often been accompanied by the suggestion that Gehry's aesthetic choices show insufficient respect for the principles and politics of Eisenhower. I'm not sure how classicism automatically equals Dwight D. Eisenhower, and I'm deeply skeptical of any kind of easy association of architectural style and political principle. Then again, in the age of the Tea Party, it's hard to know just what to make of Eisenhower anyway, since by their standards, he's practically a lefty. Some of the opposition has come from Eisenhower's family, some of whom have joined forces with those who believe that everything in Washington must be in the classical style. Not many people have tried to think seriously and honestly about the challenge of creating an effective and moving memorial to an unusual and important figure in modern American history, the only man since Ulysses S. Grant to have served both as an important general in a major war and as President of the United States. Should this man of the 20th century be memorialized with essentially the same kind of architecture that Grant was in the 19th century? Perhaps. But even if you think this is the right thing to do, recent experience in Washington, if the World War II memorial is to be any guide, suggests that we are no longer able to design classical memorials with the power and grace we did in the days of Henry Bacon, say, who designed the Lincoln Memorial, or John Russell Pope, architect of the National Gallery of Art. Two great Washington buildings that, for all their classicism, are brilliantly conceived buildings that are not copies of anything, and in which the 20th century is stunningly visible. The greatest memorial of our time isn't World War II, which sadly is pompous and banal, but Maya Lin's extraordinary Vietnam Veterans Memorial, of which we've already heard mentioned tonight, which of course was opposed bitterly by some who said that modernism was incapable of creating a memorial that would communicate adequately to the vast numbers of people who would see it, that it was an elite style, cold and abstract, revealing hostility rather than patriotism. The extraordinary success of this memorial and the brilliance and power with which it does, in fact, communicate to everyone, you would have thought would have put this argument to rest and opened the door to more willingness to continue to invent new forms of expression to honor great Americans. But no such luck. The battle going on now in Washington bears an eerie similarity to the one that Maya Lin faced more than 30 years ago, with the same dismissive and hostile tone to the arguments, a troubling testament to where the public discourse of architecture stands right now. Can criticism fix a situation like this? No, not entirely, but it has an obligation to play an active role in the dialogue, as it is done, I think, reasonably well in Washington, and as it's also done in Chicago, in another current issue in which modern architecture has come under fire, where Bertrand Goldberg's Prentice Women's Hospital, a cloverleaf-shaped concrete structure from the 1970s with round windows, an early attempt at rethinking healthcare designed by one of that city's great architects, has been marked for demolition by its owner, Northwestern University. Here we saw criticism bloom in every form, from Twitter up to extended essays. And while it does not appear to have been enough to have convinced Mayor Emanuel to stave off demolition, the pressure of critics has made the mayor's decision surely more difficult. Now, I'm not here to talk about specific works of architecture tonight, which is why I did not bring images with me, but it's still hard not to say something about the particular way in which this dispute, too, reminds us how intimately intertwined architectural issues are with everything else. Northwestern wants to tear the building down to put a medical research tower on the site. Their hospital has multiple alternative sites nearby, but they refuse to use any of them. And they've mounted a campaign against the preservationists, saying that they are against medical research. In other words, you can save this building, or you can save lives. Which do you prefer? Well, we couldn't be better thrust back into the arena of architecture and social responsibility than this argument, which attempts to pit architectural form against social benefit and suggests that saving a building will have a direct and negative effect on the social fabric. It's the worst kind of architecture-society connection to argue for, since it is utterly disingenuous. It's a completely fake dichotomy, a fake opposition, because you can, of course, believe entirely in the value of medical research and still believe that there are benefits to saving the older building. One does not preclude the other. In the case of Northwestern, they just have to put the new research tower across the street on land that their affiliate hospital already owns. As somebody who happens to be married to the head of a medical research institute, I have particularly little patience for the argument that medical research and architecture are mutually exclusive. If you put architecture up against life or food or any necessity like that, food will win, as it should. Food is about sustaining life. Architecture is about giving the already sustained life meaning. Floating all over this, I suppose, is another question, which is the extent to which architecture critics have a responsibility to the avant-garde, a responsibility to support the new, or in the case of Bertrand Goldberger in Chicago, the formerly avant-garde. If they don't, the argument might go, who will outside of architects themselves? There's some truth to this, although I have a visceral reaction against critics who support the new reflexively, as automatically as some critics reject it. But I think it's worth remembering that in architecture criticism, as in art criticism, the critics whose voices have mattered most over time have been the ones who bring to the table at least a significant degree of sympathy for the new. Mumford and Huxtable did not become the most enduring critical voices of the 20th century by virtue of rejecting innovation and invention. They did not accept it uncritically, and they often judged it harshly. But there was always a sense of belief in the notion that architects throughout history had looked for new ways to make form. And so can architects today. And the critic can and should encourage the best of them. In art criticism, consider how many people today remember Royal Cortizos, the famously reactionary art critic of the New York Herald Tribune, as compared to, say, Clement Greenberg or Harold Rosenberg, the greatest mid-century advocates of the new. John Cannaday, the art critic of the New York Times, when the Guggenheim Museum opened in 1959, is today little remembered for his impassioned denunciation of the Wright Building, even though some of his points about this great building's functional drawbacks were true, his writing today looks more like a desperate attempt to swim upstream against the current, or to reject out of fear what he did not understand. If architecture matters, it should go without saying that criticism matters. It is, after all, the closest thing we have to a living guide to architecture, to what it means, to how it affects us. But to say that criticism matters because architecture matters is not enough, because criticism needs to matter on its own terms as well. It matters if it can change architecture, and it matters if it can change people's lives, helping them to understand the architecture they live with and to make it better. For a long time, critics yearned for an age when people paid attention to architecture, when society cared about it. We now live in such a time, brought about in part, I think, because of by the very proliferation of architectural voices we've been talking about. The challenge we face now is to encourage, even celebrate those voices, while recognizing that criticism itself, like architecture itself, is not democracy. Crowdsourcing is not the express train to wisdom. The most popular is not always the best. The new is not always easy to understand. And the last word will always go to history. But this is exactly the critic's challenge. In an age in which new media makes our attention spans ever shorter, it is the critic's job to take the long view. Maybe that's the most important thing of all that criticism can give us, to help us step back from the noise, to try and maintain the luxury of extended thought, to think long term. Architecture, after all, is about the long term. And it is the critic's job to observe how it performs its alchemy, how it does its magic, how it affects us, and to encourage and support that process, enhancing the impact of architecture as a resonant presence in all of our lives. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm told the format allows for some questions. Is that right? I don't know. Yes. So if there are a few, I think Scott will bring the microphone to you.
Yes, if you could just wait for, you can raise your hand and I'd be happy to come to you. We are recording tonight's program, so we want to make sure we capture your question. Yes.
Thank you. May I ask you, as an architectural critic, describe to us what you saw in the wake of Sandy?
What I saw, that's an interesting question. What I saw in the week of Sandy. I saw the vulnerability of a lot of architecture, of course. But I saw some very dramatic things. Even I live on the Upper West Side in New York, where we were lucky enough not to be seriously affected and never lost power, but it's still pretty sobering to look out your window and watch a huge tree in Central Park, sort of fall out of the park onto a parked car next to the park, and things like that. But you know, what I really saw and what affected me most was not anything specifically about architecture, but the larger questions about the urban environment and the fact that we have been in denial about rising sea levels. We have been in denial about climate change. And we have no choice but to pay more attention to that. The Museum of Modern Art a few years ago did a very impressive show called Rising Currents, in which they asked several architects to make proposals for projects in Manhattan that would deal with the fact that sea levels, water levels were rising. It's a show that did not get nearly as much attention as it should have. It now appears to be the most prescient show imaginable, and one that everybody now, myself included, is going back and looking again at the catalog and saying, why didn't we all pay more attention to this? So I think the discourse is going to change dramatically in the next 5 years, I think. And architecture itself, buildings themselves, will be less the issue than where we put buildings, and how we and struggling with the issues of soft and hard scape, and which is a sort of new definition to me, but now I think is going to become much more common. The question of do you deal with water via a huge solid wall that tries to block it, or do you try to make the city almost function a little bit more like a marsh and be able to take water and not be damaged by it and have it come up and recede? There are a lot of interesting discussions on both sides of that issue, but it's a key discussion that we are going to have now going forward. So as to individual buildings, it's not as much a concern so far as Sandy's concerned, as I said, about where we put things and why. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Thank you very much, and thank you
Thank you.
for that wonderful lecture, and congratulations on the prize.
Thank you. Thank you.
I wonder if you would comment on this emerging talk of relaxing the height standards in Washington, D.C.
Relaxing the height standards in Washington, D.C. Probably not a good idea. I mean, if, now I don't know that making K Street look like Roslyn would necessarily be that much worse than K Street looks now. Nevertheless, I certainly wouldn't think it would be better either. I'm somebody who loves tall buildings. I've written a book about skyscrapers. I've looked at them all over the world. I think it is the great American building form, in the same way that, say, the jazz is the great American musical form that we've given to the world. The skyscraper is the great building form we've given to the world. But even so, there's something very nice about an American city in which you do not have skyscrapers and can't. We can do with one without. It's just fine. And just today I was looking, I walked across the mall from the other side of the city today, and just seeing the monument be the tallest thing, and the Capitol, that's how you want it to be. I'm all for change, but I don't think that particular change would benefit the city particularly. Okay, so.
Sir, thank you for all of your thoughts this evening. And I wasn't going to bring this up, but since you mentioned the Frank Gehry controversy over the memorial, have any of the critics considered the effect of the screen wall that is being proposed, that is essentially the height and length of the Department of the Education building, which we know is not Washington's finest building. However, I think to me, this seems like a kind of forced solution that reminds me of a Japanese muralist in the 18th century who was trying to create the largest mural in the world, And the question is, would he have done that to obscure the Department of Education building?
Well, I know that the Department of Education is certainly not the building Frank Gehry admires the most, nor is it the one I admire the most. And you know, having it covered is not necessarily a diminishment to the urban environment of Washington. That said, that said, you know, and I do know that they have been conscientious in trying to make sure that the screen does not block light coming into the building or completely block views out of it. That's been part of what Gehry claims he has been trying to do. I think there are arguments on both sides about the screen. I'm much more comfortable having a debate about the Eisenhower Memorial be about the wisdom or lack thereof of designing the screen that way than saying we have to make it look like the Jefferson Memorial. I mean, that's the argument that I reject. A serious discussion about the screen is a legitimate and reasonable kind of discussion to have. Tonight's not the time to have that whole discussion, but and there's not anyone from the, you know, from Gary's office to really explain it. Nevertheless, that's at least a reasonable discussion and one that I would be happy to see happen. So,
Thank you and congratulations.
thank you.
I'm wondering, over your history of architectural criticism, who are the architects you most admire and the buildings you most admire, and why?
Who are the architects I most admired and the buildings I most admired, and why? If you asked me that at the beginning of the lecture, we could have spent an hour on it, but now it's a hard question to answer very briefly. And I'm tempted to answer by shamelessly plugging my book, Why Architecture Matters, which sort of tries to respond and actually cite some of the things I admire most. Of contemporary architects, probably the two American architects I've admired most in our contemporary time are Frank Gehry and Robert Venturi, two very different architects, but nevertheless, each in a different way, tremendously important. But there are many, many others, and I really am kind of Catholic in my taste with a small c. And so, I mean, I could really talk to you about 10 or 12 and lots of different buildings and lots of different projects. I think Walt Disney Concert Hall in Los Angeles is probably the greatest public building in the United States of the last 25, 30 years, let's say the last generation. Historically, I tend to, while of course I admire all of the, you know, the architects who are in the canon, Frank Lloyd Wright and Mies van der Rohe and Le Corbusier and so forth, and probably for me, the greatest buildings in all in America are Wright's Falling Water and possibly his Unity Temple and a couple of others. But it's hard as a critic to say, I mean, you probably want me to say something surprising and different, but in fact, you know, the reality is if you asked a music critic, you know, what the greatest piece of music is, he might probably say Beethoven's Fifth Symphony or Beethoven's late quartets or something like that, even though those are not, you know, rather than pick some obscure thing you've never heard of, just to sort of trick you up. But I mean, the reality is the things in the canon generally are the greatest. I do have a historical bias for architects who are slightly eccentric and who have twisted and done interesting riffs on history that surprise a certain amount, which is why, you know, I love Nicholas Hawksmoor, the English architect, rather more than Christopher Wren, his contemporary, say, or John Soane more than John Nash, or Lutyens, Sir Edwin Lutyens, the great classical architect of the early 20th century. And in fact, I have a great love of classicism. I'm not at all, I'm a passionate modernist who's not an ideological modernist, and I sort of like a lot of wonderful older stuff. So, my bias is probably to architects who, by nature, kind of tweak and surprise in certain ways, rather than give you an exquisite, magnificent rendition of the expected, which is kind of what Christopher Wren could do so brilliantly. So,
And I think we have time for just one last question.
Gentleman with the okay, thank you.
As the daughter of an architectural photographer who took photographs of Frank Lloyd Wright and Mies van der Rohe buildings and others, I'm curious what role architectural photography plays in your work, and if changes in photography have affected how you do your criticism.
It's a wonderful question, actually, architectural photography. That, too, is a rich subject that, nobody wants to hear another lecture, so, but I'll try to answer in just a minute or so. In Why Architecture Matters, there's a little section about how a lot of architectural photography has become iconic and has, in fact, formed people's views of buildings that become larger almost in the culture than the buildings themselves. Probably the best example, at least in mid to late 20th century work, is the famous Julius Shulman photograph in Los Angeles of that modern glass house out in the Hollywood Hills with the beautiful women in long gowns sort of lounging there as you see the lights of the city twinkling. I mean, that created, kind of crystallized a certain image of modern architecture in California that became really more powerful in the culture almost than the buildings themselves. So architectural photography has the ability to do that. I think a lot of the work of Ezra Stoller has done that with many, many buildings. However, in terms of how I use it in my criticism, the answer is I try not to, because I will never write about any building I haven't seen myself. So I would never write about a building from photographs. The most I will ever do is maybe a passing brief reference somewhere, but I would never make a building a subject of anything if I haven't been there. And so photography, for me, is always an after-the-fact thing and not something that shapes my own writing or work. But that said, also, I've really enjoyed collaborating with a lot of photographers and talking with them about my view of a building, their view of a building, what images to take, and so forth. Robert Polidori, who I used to work with at the New Yorker for a long time, Todd Eberly, Richard Barnes. I mean, there's several really wonderful architectural photographers who it's a great joy to talk about a building with, and after we've both visited it, and say, what about this? What did you think of this? Why, what would it be if we did this, and so forth. But that's, again, a separate thing. So, thank you all very much again. Thank you. Okay.
Wow, what a treat. I think you just earned this fancy bowl tonight. So thank you very much. I do want to thank all of you for being here this evening. And I also want to mention that you may have noticed that we have videotaped this presentation. So it will be going up on our website in short order. So be sure to revisit and tell your colleagues and friends to check out our website so that they also can enjoy this amazing presentation. Congratulations on this honor, and thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
And they're going to take another picture.